African Ascent, need I say, is profoundly honored, and I mean every bit of it, to bring someone whom I consider is one of the leading global philosophers and certainly the leading Africana and African philosopher that the reading public is really simply honored and privileged to have. I could have introduced my guest, as I always do, extemporaneously, but I have decided against this. He has done so much that I would do injustice if I were to simply summarize it. So I thought that I should pay tribute to him by reading directly from a biography that was written on him, perhaps written by him to my precious audience. Enjoy the bio. Lewis R. Gordon is an Afro-Jewish philosopher, political thinker, educator, and musician, drums and piano, who grew up in the Bronx, New York, where he attended Evander Childs High School, played jazz in New York nightclubs, and went to Lehman College under the Lehman Scholars Program, where he graduated with honors in political science and philosophy as a member of the Chi chapter of Phi Beta Kappa. His undergraduate mentor and lifetime friend, Gary Schwartz, with whom he also studied Greek and ancient literature, was director of the LSP. Gordon then taught social studies at Lehman High School, where he founded the Second Chance program for in-school truants, and then studied for his doctorate at Yale University, where he met his graduate mentor, the great Maurice Nathanson, a phenomenologist who was also a child of Yiddish theater in Brooklyn, New York, and whose mentor was Alfred Schutz, the great Austrian Jewish phenomenologist of the social sciences. Gordon's research in philosophy is in Africana philosophy, existentialism, phenomenology, social and political philosophy, and philosophy of the human sciences. His philosophy and social theory have been the subjects of many studies in a variety of disciplines. While he has written on problems of method and disciplinary formation in the human sciences, Gordon has more recently devoted attention to problems in philosophy of physics, especially through a series of ongoing discussions and research projects with his former informal student and now colleague, Stephen Alexander, who teaches physics at Dartmouth College. In addition to theories of social transformation, decolonization, and liberation, Gordon's research in social and political philosophy also addresses problems of justice and its normative scope. As a public intellectual, Gordon has written for a variety of political forums, newspapers, and magazines such as Truth Out, the Pambuska News, and the Mail and Guardian, and has lectured across the globe, founded and co-founded journals and organizations, including Radical Philosophy Review and the Caribbean Philosophical Association, of which he was the first president, 2003 to 2008. He also participates in several international research groups, such as Thinking Africa at Rhodes University in South Africa, the Center for Caribbean Thought in Mona, Jamaica, the Institute for the Study of Dutch Slavery in Amsterdam, the Factory of Ideas in Salvador, Brazil, the Forum on Contemporary Theory in Baroda, India, the Humanities Institute at the Birkbeck College of Law, the Center for Global Studies and the Humanities, Decolonial Studies at Duke University, the French-German Summer School in Toulouse, France, and the Kate Hamburger Center for Advanced Study in Bonn, Germany. Gordon is married to the political theorist, a prolific writer in her own right, whom I intend to bring to African Ascent if she concurs sometimes in the future, Jane Anna Gordon. His complete curriculum vitae can be downloaded here, and his Wikipedia entry a rare privilege for a young philosopher. Entry can be found here. A shorter version of his curriculum is also available here. I could say more and more and more and more, but I would like to restrict this bio and simply mention something intimate, something personal about what he did for me a few years ago. I remember once going to Brown University, invited by a good friend of mine, Nigel Gibson, who in turn wanted to invite me to this extraordinary mind, as he described him, who is running a foundational department of Africana Studies at Brown University. I did. I had never seen Lewis before. I was literally shocked by his mastery of philosophical literature, which he would just espouse, and ideas would run like water from him without mistakes, without interruptions. I was dumbfounded. At the time, Lewis was, I think, in his late 30s and perhaps early 40s. He was so kind to me at the time when I was looking for a career, expressed an interest, and within a month or two, he managed to find a job for me, brought me to Brown, where he introduced me, among many others, to his best friend and his colleague, his intellectual partner, Paget Henry. Between the two of them, I'm very proud to tell the world that I have two of my best friends. So Lewis Gordon, among many, many other things that he has done, is also the man who transformed what was a peripheral program of Africana Studies at Brown into a full-fledged department, and it now prides itself in being, if not the leading, to be one of the leading departments of Africana Studies in the world. African Ascent is honored to bring Lewis Gordon for the first time, and I had made him commit himself, considering how busy he is now that he's teaching in this area, to come and share his research programs with us at least once a year. African Ascent would be so lucky to enjoy this intellectual festivity with you, which will begin tonight. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for that generous introduction, Teodros. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Now, what I thought, Lois, is to do this. We're going to be very rigorous. African Ascent takes pride in attempting to be a rigorous television program. So what we're going to do with your cooperation is to give a crash course, really, on philosophy in black / Africana philosophy to this beloved audience that I have, thousands of them. I'm sure they're going to remain glued to listen to you. You're going to mesmerize them. So let me begin with this quotation that I stumbled on while teaching Africana philosophy, which gives a portrait of a philosopher, if not the philosopher, as the Egyptians conceived of him, by scholar Obinga, who wrote the first chapter to this book, which I'm using in my Africana philosophy course. Thanks to you and Paget Henry for introducing me to this field, and for really enabling me to write at least one book in this area under your tutelage, literally. So let me begin reading that passage. He is the one whose heart is informed about these things which would be otherwise ignored. The one who is clear-sighted when he is deep into a problem. The one who is moderate in his actions, who penetrates ancient writings, whose advice is sought to unravel complications, who is really wise, who instructed his own heart, who stays awake at night as he looks for the right paths, who suppresses what he accomplished yesterday, who is wiser than a sage, who brought himself to wisdom, who asks for advice and sees to it that he is asked advice. This, according to Obinga, is the image of the philosopher as the Egyptians imagined it.
Indeed. Indeed. In fact, one of the big debates around the question of Egypt, and it's funny we call it Egypt. You know, one of the things Theosophus Obinga would point out, and many others, is that Egypt is not actually the name that ancient Egyptians used. You know, Egypt is the Greek name, and we forget when we look at ancient Egypt that there's not one ancient Egypt. There is a series of ancient Egypts from Old Kingdom to Middle Kingdom to New Kingdom. And we pay so much attention to the New Kingdom and to the impositions in ancient Egypt that we forget what the people may have called themselves. And it was a vast region of the ancient world, okay? So, you know, the ancient term was Kemet, and it simply meant the dark lands. And there are many understood because we forget that there was a time when people went up to Africa. We live in a world in which there is a geopolitical, a geoepistemic, by which I mean a way of looking at knowledge, that orients us in such a way that we look today at Europe as up and we look at Africa as down. But this was a world from which these ideas came, in which Africa was up. You looked to Africa the way you would look to the stars. You oriented yourself when the sun would rise. And today, people think of the sun rising on the right because they're looking to the north. But there was a time when people looked to the south as up, so the sun rose on the left and set on the right. This gives you a clue about orientation. And one of the things that you understand with orientation, and what is being hinted at in the quote you read, is that although the world may be before you, there could be many things, as Kierkegaard put it, that you could see yet fail to see. Orienting your vision, looking at the world in just a slightly different way, could disclose so much that you fail to see. And so one of the hints about being a philosopher in that sense is about having a different orientation to reality, and the understanding that reality also includes yourself. So it means becoming also a different orientation to yourself. Now that different orientation to the self, of course, means the self is realized as fallible, that you can make mistakes. And that's why in that quotation, there was a hint for humility, okay? Of course, it also connects to the etymology of philosophy.
Correct.
Because, you know, it's funny, you know, we have philia, you know, it's philosophia, and even though it says love, some people, you know, love is not easily understood. There could be erotic love, there could be fraternal love, friendship love. It's weird to walk around, though, when you think of the Sophia part, wisdom, to say you love wisdom. But what's complex, and this is what Obinga pointed out, is that the word Sophia is not an ancient Greek word. In fact, you may notice its connections etymologically to many what we would call today African words. For instance, even among the Akans, Sappho, like, you know, or if you could say, no, I'm sorry, you'd have Onyama, right? Or you have these other terms. But when you have Sappho or Saphia, these are East African words. And, you know, and even today, we could see it transformed even in Swahili to Safia. And so it means wise. So this connection then about seeking wisdom makes us realize there's something complex about it. And it's funny, you know, among the Greeks, we're talking about the Africans, but among the Greeks, one of my favorite dialogues by Plato. And by the way, Plato wasn't his name, it was Aristocles, which means the best.
Is that right? But I don't realize that.
Yeah, Platon is actually broad shoulders because he wrestled.
I see.
But the thing about one of my favorite of his texts is the Symposium.
Yes.
And the symposium is a meditation on love. But what many people don't realize is the meditation on love makes a move from love to the lover of wisdom. In the dialogue, it shifts to a point where the lover of Socrates, Alcibiades, comes in and talks about his lover, Socrates. So you have the lover of wisdom. And what he says relates to what you have just read in a beautiful way, because Socrates was a physically unattractive man.
I see. Stub-nosed.
All kinds of things.
Among other things. Yes.
Among other things. But it meant one had to see beneath that to get to know him. And what his lover said is, you'll be intoxicated by his beauty.
I see.
So one of the metaphors of philosophy is it is at first ugly on the outside, but beautiful inside. And you could see in that quote that you read, that quotation you read, a meditation on what you may at first see, but fail to see. And if you could see a little deeper, you can actually see a richer dimension of reality in life. And Socrates was a metaphor of that, just as if we were to look in ancient Egypt, or Kemet, the meditations, for instance, of Ani, who it is believed wrote the Egyptian Book of the Dead. Ani had these reflections, of course, because with death is an understanding that there is a mystery also to life. So these deeper dimensions of what philosophy is about can emerge within a context as the one you just read.
It's remarkable. And correct me if I'm wrong. It also intrigued me on another plane. What I sense when I read this passage is that the Egyptians were not sensitive to what we call race. What you get is a description of the philosopher as if he is outside of space and time, simply floating in the universe with these essential characteristics that they have appended to him.
Well, there's a tension. There are different models. Mm-hmm. You know, the model, today we impose on the ancient world a geography that they didn't use. So for instance, it's very weird, isn't it, that we imagine ancient people as stopping where today is the Suez Canal when they think of Africa.
That's right.
When in fact, those ancient people spilled all the way over into West Asia. And if you go into deep antiquity, for instance, if you look at the work of Charles Finch, you'll find out that there was a more ancient, darker communities of people in a lot of these regions, but they had no reason to think of themselves as, for instance, African. So it's not just race. It's even the very topography, the very language we use, even about continents. You know, there was no reason for an ancient African to think of her or himself as African, just as what we could call an ancient European. There's no reason for them to think of these things at all. But the complicated thing is that there was a tension because, you see, we forget that philosophy had its birth in a relationship to myth. And in fact, some of the primal myths, right, made their way as certain groups would conquer certain communities. The communities they conquered may have ideas that at a level of knowledge conquer them.
I see.
And so when the ancient Greeks, for instance, were in conflict with the Persians, some of the Persian ideas came in, and one ancient Persian idea was the idea of chronos. And chronos, from which we get chronology, right, was the god of time. And what's very interesting is the offspring of the god of time was manes, from which you get manifester or manifestation. And if you put them together, phanes, from which you get manifestation or manifester. So from phanes, you get phenomena, things that appear. You see? So if we understand phanes, so that was an error, not manes. Manes, I was thinking about Manito for a second, that's another person.
Yeah, all right.
But phanes, you get then chronos, time, and you have phanes, manifestation. And this has been the primal mythic struggle. Because on the one hand, you're struggling with the eternal time, But at the same time, for something to be made manifest, something had to appear. Something had to come out from nowhere. So you had the primal conflict between permanence and change.
Okay.
And the way the Europeans have talked about it has been in terms of two figures, Parmenides and Heraclitus. And these individuals, one thought about change, one thought about permanence.
Being and becoming.
Now if we get back into the African context, we begin to see something, again, we call it African context, but that world was more
The
rich.
world context.
For instance, a lot of people we call ancient Greeks, for instance, if you look at Mycenae, if you look at, what's today Crete or Creta, a lot of those people looked like you. They didn't look like the way these movies make these blonde white guys walking around. That's a different period. And so a lot of the ancient world was a lot browner and a lot blacker. Well, as these individuals would think and go through these ideas, one of the things we have to bear in mind is that there were also struggles in the world about how do you relate to time, not simply as an abstraction, but time as a cyclical motion. How do you deal with things, for instance, if you think in a lunar term? And remember, a lot of ancient calendars were lunar. And as these ideas, there was also the fact that there were images in terms of how one thinks about the fertility of life in terms of things such as a mother. So once we begin to understand this, one of the things that's missing, if we go back to that symposium, Platonic dialogue I talked about, which, by the way, just means drinking together, the drinking party, there was an understanding that in Socrates, he at least spoke in terms of his learning from a woman by the name of Diotima. So you have this struggle not only about permanence and change, but there was also this complex struggle about the idea of change as a form of birth, which meant that there were powerful images of mothers, for instance, at the very dawn of the very ideas that eventually became philosophical ideas. This, however, began to take a very interesting shift when the philosophical ideas began to ask themselves a different type of question. See, if it's simply about trying to learn about the world, you could simply say, how do you figure, well, how does that work? Or why does the moon rise? Why does the sun come up? That's one kind of question. But it's a different kind of a question when you ask, what is going on? How do I justify how I talk about the sun rising, the moon going, and so forth? Justification itself became a different type of question. And at that moment, when a meditation on how do I justify what I think, what is the justification even for justification itself? How are ideas such that they even make sense? That begins to move into what we call philosophy proper. And what's interesting about it is that we hear certain terms as if they're mysterious. For instance, one of the terms you always hear is logos.
Yes.
And it sounds mysterious.
Very much so.
But the word logos, its etymological roots, right, its origins, is the same as the word log. Literally, a log. And if you think about it, what do you do when you chop down a tree and you have logs? You stack them, you put them together. You don't say, I'm going to put this wood, that wood, a brick, a can. You have an order to the wood. And that order of logging, as we have with cataloging, logging ideas, that's really what's going on behind the idea of logos, because you log according to a principle. So justification, principle, ideas, they all link. And those are the origins of what we know as philosophical discourse. But it's very important for us to understand that it's not entirely divorced from its roots in mythic discourses as well.
Incredible. Now, additionally, Louis, each and every time I read this passage, I'm also awestruck by the absence of any discussion of either rationality or reasonableness in it. Why is it that Egyptians did not accord much importance to these central categories out of which philosophy emerges?
Well, I don't think that the Egyptians didn't. And not only Egyptians, I mean, many people in the ancient world. It depends on which period, because you'd find these ideas also being thought through, for instance, in India, in China. Well, today China. There wasn't a China properly speaking back then. That was formed through a political union from the Qing dynasty and onward. But there were ancient ideas where it was really a mystery. And one of the things that humanity began to struggle with very early is something where, to illustrate it, I had a conversation the other day. I gave a talk at the University of Pennsylvania, and there were a lot of African-American students in the audience. And as we were talking, they said something that I think is very familiar, but also disturbing, which is, here they are pursuing higher education, and many were felt to feel guilty about pursuing it. And I said, I never, ever, ever, ever apologize for being an academic. And one of the reasons for this is I'm not only an academic. I know I'm known in a context where I do public intellectual work, but I consider academic work vital work. There's a connection between every academic, every educator, every writer, every artist, and that early human being, perhaps 200,000 years ago, who scratched out a symbol. And the moment we scratch out a symbol, the moment the human beings made the move from sign to symbol, the moment we became symbolic, we entered a world of meaning. And within that world of meaning, we began to realize that we've disclosed a reality that is so radically different from many of the other animals around us. And in that reality is powerful because, you see, that reality is not only something we produce, but it's something that also produces us. It changes us. And as we're changed, we begin to say, what is going on here? And that's where we begin to struggle around understanding it and begin to deal with rationality and reason and these things. The funny thing, though, is this. We often forget there's a distinction between rationality and reason. Rationality is a lot like when I talked about logos, the logging. And if you notice, in order to stack logs, in order to have a principle, you need to have repetition. And in order to have repetition, you need to have something that organizes the next stage, which means you have to have consistency. But if you have consistency, you've constrained the model, and that because every step down the road, it has to be consistent with the previous steps. So consistency, logically, logos, logically, leads to maximal consistency. Now, this sounds very abstract, but
break it down.
But the thing we begin to realize, and this is the problem, right? What happens when consistency now has to evaluate consistency? It is constrained by its very principles and rules, which means all it does is reassert consistency. It, in effect, leads to a paradox. It constrains itself so much to be consistent that it fails to deal with something that every human being knows. And I put it this way in very straightforward language. Every human being knows that he or she, you and I, would never ever want to spend the rest of our lives with a maximally consistent person. In fact, what we would say is, my God, that person is so unreasonable. And that's the point. Reason evaluates even consistency, because to be reasonable is to understand when it is necessary or important to be inconsistent. The paradox of reason is that to evaluate rationality, reason must transcend it. It has to be more than it.
This is incredible, Lewis. Consider this proposition then. There are those who conceive of rationality as nothing more than a correspondence, they like to say, between means and ends. What are they talking about?
That is talking about a particular principle of action. They're confusing rationality with intelligence. Mm-hmm. And intelligence uses rationality, but genuine intelligence has to understand when certain principles of rationality break down. What's the transition from being a child to an adult? A child is in a Manichaean world. It's a world of black and white. There are good people, bad people. There are those with authority, those without. That's the child's world. The transition, what creates anxiety in adolescence, is the moment of responsibility. That suddenly, if you're responsible, although the world may at first appear black and white, responsibility emerges when you discover the world isn't black and white. It's the point at which you have to make a decision, and the decision may be to go against something that you have previously committed yourself to. That is reason, that is responsibility, that's the adult world. And the adult world is a complex world, because the adult world is a world in which we understand that life is many things, but one thing that life is not always is fair.
Now, Lewis, there are those who know you, and quite rightly, as one of the most systematic, coherent, radical thinkers of our time, who did not have to use categories such as race, gender, or class to establish careers for themselves. But then you transition, correct me if I'm wrong, from radical thought, which included mastery of Marxian categories, Hegelian categories, Kantian categories, and most importantly, Sartre himself. You're considered to be one of the most intelligent interpreters of Sartre. In fact, most people until recently used to identify you as fundamentally Sartrean, although you're a Fanon scholar. And
Yeah.
you yourself in this seminal piece called Theory in Black, from which I'm going to quote shortly, you contend that there are deep reasons that account for the shift from radical thought to philosophizing about blackness.
Well,
Why the shift?
Well, no, but it's never been a shift. You know, one of the problems, well, there's several things. First thing is, I've never, ever taken a position that to talk about race is a particularity. That somehow, if we don't talk about it, we're more universal. I've rejected that throughout. The second thing is, in all my writings, from the very beginning onwards, I've been critical of the presuppositions that anything white, to talk about white thinkers is universal, and talk about black thinkers is somehow particular. So that's always been a fallacy, as far as I'm concerned. And one of the things that I've also taken that's actually more radical is that what's hidden in the presupposition of white universality versus black particularity is the particularity of whiteness. So what it does is it closes off the capacity for a proper radical self-critique. The point at which whiteness realizes its particularity is the point at which whiteness realizes there's a world beyond whiteness. And the failure to do that collapses whiteness into a godlike or deified existence. So I've been very critical about that. The other thing that we should bear in mind is when I started off, when I said I did radical theory, for me it meant going to the roots, going to what real thinking is about. And what real thinking is about is not being constrained by fetishes or prejudices or the things that would hold us back from the more frightening aspects of thought. You know when I just talked about reason and rationality?
Yes.
There's been a project in the modern world of trying to domesticate reason by yoking it to rationality, you see? But this has been the paradox of reason. Reason, as broader than rationality, won't behave. And this misbehaving of reason, I've argued, is at the heart of the misbehavior of theory and the effort not to see the underside of theory, the contradictions, the ways in which there are aspects of the world that don't behave.
Which you appropriately called decadence.
Well, no. Decadence is the effort to make the world behave. That's the problem. Because decadence basically closes the world off from reality. It makes it seem complete. It treats it like a god. It fetishizes method. It says, I have the method, I have all the answers, I don't need to look any further.
That is disciplinary decadence.
Disciplinary decadence. Decadence says there's nothing else to do.
Disciplinary decadence, on the other hand.
Really, that's what, disciplinary decadence is when one says, as a philosopher, a sociologist, a literary scholar, whatever it is, I have all the answers. There's nothing more to learn. That is a form of deification of one's discipline. It's a form of hubris. It's a turning away from reality. However, I went a little further and argued that, in a way, those contradictions are the darker side of thought. And in fact, the effort to evade race, the effort to evade dealing with the contradictions of the society, is an effort to close it off from the double conscious, potentiated contradictions of modern life.
Let's talk about double conscience for a while, for the sake of my audience.
Sure.
In what sense is Du Bois, who is the one who constructed it, speaking about double consciousness? What does it exactly mean to an average person?
Well, many people talked about double consciousness, actually. Emerson, Nietzsche, but,
yes.
the Du Boisian version can be looked at in this way. There's a world that gives black people a certain image of ourselves, okay? We know that isn't true, but that world controls the conditions and tells us that is true. Some of us, failing to pay attention to the contradictions of that world, end up believing it. And so we see ourselves as we're seen through hostile eyes. That's the first stage of double consciousness. However, some of us encounter the contradictions of that. So for instance, there's a world that created a concept called a Negro. But black people weren't Negroes before. And then there's a world that created black people. But we weren't black people before. In fact, there weren't white people before. And once we begin to realize the intimate connection between the creation of white and black people, the intimate connections between all these things, we begin to ask ourselves, well, what creates this? Now you can see the critical consciousness emerge. When you see those contradictions, you move to potentiated double consciousness. That's seeing how you're seeing and seeing what produces how you see how you're seen. A good example I could give is a story. When I was a high school teacher, there was a period where I was doing some substitute teaching before I was a permanent teacher, and I was placed among a class of working class white students. And so I thought, okay, they're working class white students, they're all sitting there staring at me. I figured, let's create a good environment in which to speak. So I said something that shocked them. I said, could you tell me all the negative images you know of black people? And so at first, meekly a kid said, well, black people commit crimes. So I put it on the board. Black people take drugs, put it on the board. Black people are, after a while, all their hands were up, so we had a whole long list. So I looked at them, I said, okay, none of you have ever committed a crime. None of your relatives, and they were shy. None of you have ever taken drugs, and they were shy. And sex, you're all virgins, and they were, right? And after a while, they began to realize, right, that they were invested in a false image even of themselves. And what's interesting is what many black people know, now we pick the other words. Well, if you look at anything studying black people, they have all these social pathologies. Alcoholism, incest, child abuse, you name it. All the pathologies, crime, investing in black people. And then you ask a very simple question. What do, say, children growing up in the United States of America experience? Do they experience crime? Do they experience alcoholism around them? Are there molestations? Are there issues around interraciality, so to speak? All the things that people talk about with black people. And then what you realize is, if you were to describe a book on, say, black child care or the psychology of black children, what you have discovered is that you're actually describing the reality of children in the United States of America. So you see what I'm getting at? The sterilized image of the white child care book or the white world hides its contradictions. The black world shows the contradictions, so you ask anybody who can reason, which one of them is reality? And you see the point. The actual more universal reality is through the engagement with the black world, because it has both and. It knows what the white world is pretending to be, and it knows what the world is. This is what, all the way through even hip hop, what the kids were trying to say is there's a world out there that people would like to have, but what they're living every day and see is the way the world is. The reason many people are attracted to that, whether it's hip hop, jazz, reggae, whether it's what you hear in world music, all of these things that come from the black world, what I've argued is because that world is actually making you stare in the face of reality.
Incredible. And now, Lois will be slightly more academic, but I'm sure you're going to break it down even more. There is a difference between philosophy in black and Africana philosophy, isn't there?
Yes,
What
there
is the difference?
Philosophy in black relates to the ideas that emerge from the category of blackness. The people who live blackness in the world are not necessarily African. An Australian Aboriginal gets up every day as black. A Maori, black. There are people in parts of India, black. There are people who, in different designations in their lives, get up in the day and live the experience of blackness. But they're not necessarily African. Africana philosophy, or African diaspora, deals specifically with those that come from African. But even there, it's complicated, because the things that are African are not necessarily black.
Correct.
And so there's a point at which the two worlds could meet, but they're not identical.
Now, let's return to that passage, the image of the philosopher with which we began, and take a second look at it through these two categories that you've so neatly distinguished. Is that philosopher an African philosopher, or is he a black philosopher?
Well, that philosopher is already in a very unusual situation, because that philosopher had no reason to think of himself, or it could have been her, as black or African, because that was a world in which one understood oneself as Nubian, one understood oneself as, whether if one were from, depends on which part of Kemet, whether one was really connected through, for instance, Canaanites, Hyksos, all these different groups converged in what we knew as ancient Egypt. So that person had no reason to think of himself or herself as even African. So the question there is not really to that person, it's really to us.
To us.
Because we are going to dig up these ideas and put them within the matrix of how we understand the world, just as there may be new categories in the future when they look back and may look at this interview, if they come across it at a tape, and there may be a whole genealogy we're connected to that's to something we never ever thought about, you see? So within the framework of the world in which we live, the question is, at what period were those ideas? And if you're looking at those ideas from a period, say, around the Middle Kingdom, that's where that area of the world would be in terms of what we think of today as either brown or black. We also know it as African. So the answer could be both. If you're going by the New Kingdom, it was a multiracial society by then because they were conquered by Greeks, Romans, and you know what I mean? And as we know, when you get conquered, you don't control your progeny. So it's a different kind of civilization by then. However, it's important for us to understand this because remember I talked about the symbol?
Yes.
The meaning
Symbol
of those
the sign.
things.
Yes.
Right? The sign is something we share with other animals. Dogs, cats can understand the sign, you know, because signs tend to be, you know, cup, one-to-one, right? Can point. But a symbol has so many meanings. With a symbol you enter a world. And once race emerged as a symbol, because we have to, you know, and I could talk about the history of race, because a lot of people don't understand it. It's a complex world. It's now in a world with an anthropology that has meaning to it. And in that world, what we don't understand is this is not the end of the story, because that world began to change another world. There was a world in which the differentiating categories are roughly like what we call today gender. In other words, in that world, it was about being normal as a man and whoever was not a normal man. In other words, women were treated as deviations from man. But when race came along, suddenly certain women and men belonged to the same group against another group. And it transformed what a woman was. And so now in this world of race and gender, you see, we now are beginning to have a proliferation of categories. Many people make the error of thinking there's this kind of substance human being walking around and race was tagged onto it. Absolutely ridiculous. It's absolutely false.
Amazing.
What actually we need to pay attention to is that a lot of the ways we even talk about the human was actually produced in the time of race. In other words, the relationship between race and how we talk about anthropology, sociology, economics, all of these things, they were actually simultaneously produced. It's in the production of the human sciences that race was also emerging. And if that's the case, as we attempt to produce, and this is something that a French philosopher named Foucault understood very well, he understood that that if we're going to transform a lot of these categories in the form of a humanism, we have to understand that we're producing new kinds of human. And we're witnessing it in political terms right now as we think about LGBT communities, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transsexual communities, but not just those. When we think about women, we think about women in a world that's radically different than people thought about women before, because we have a fundamental value called equality. And the error people made is they think they could keep men the same, just make women equal to men. It doesn't work that way. If you are going to make women equal to men, you change the relation of man to woman, and you change man. You see? And this is why the misogynist, the homophobe, the people of hate are frightened, because they know the world, it's about changing the world. It changes them. And as that happens, it's an error for us to believe, as we change ourselves and change the world, that we're going to remain the same. So we, you and I, and everybody in this room may be connected to changes that may have a completely different category in the future of how people read back on us in the past, just as we're reading back on that philosopher in black, brown, or African.
That's remarkable. Of course, since I have made a promise that you're going to come to African Ascent, which would enable me to visit these rich facets of your project, tonight, before the show is over, as a segue to future projects, I would like you to summarize for the audience what you mean by philosophy of culture, and what the place of the African philosopher or the philosopher in black would be in that philosophy of culture.
Well, one of the things that I think you're referring to an essay, a lecture I gave that was published under the title Theory in Black.
Correct.
Yeah, that was the inaugural Chancellor Lecture at the University of California, Berkeley. And I was invited to do that by Abdul Jan Mohammed, who is a brilliant intellectual. I mean, I could just go on and on about Abdul Jan Mohammed, but he asked me to be the inaugural Chancellor Lecture. And in that lecture, because I know that English departments particularly are thinking about the concept of theory, I was curious, because if you look at how theory is looked at in English departments or in many literature programs, it's a fetishizing of European theory. And it's almost as if theory must be white. And so I began to explore the fact that that's a fallacy of that kind of closure I talked about when I talked about whiteness, that in order to do that, you have to hide the black side of theory. And I'm using it metaphorically and literally. So theory in black, what I argue, is theory, the way I just talked about the universalizing capacity of looking at the world in black. Because theory, to be theory, has to be willing to look back at itself critically, which means it must examine its contradictions. So once I did that, the question of culture comes in a rather complex way, because as we know, I just talked about theory, but in many literature programs right now, they also talk about culture, cultural studies, these other, but they're not actually talking about culture. You see, there's a radical question of culture that's often overlooked. People are talking about mores, folkways, popular aspects of culture. But what culture, in the way I use culture, is actually the human being. Culture, as I use it, is the disclosure of the human world, disclosure of the world of meaning.
Okay. We have about 4 minutes left,
Wow.
since I promised
flew
my
by.
audience that you're going to give us a crash course just on the tip of the iceberg. We have just begun the conversation with Lewis Gordon. I haven't even gone beyond thinking through the first one page or 2 pages of this seminal piece, Theorying Black, that he briefly talked about, to which I'll return in future projects. But now that we have about 3 minutes left, I would like you to take this time and say something that you think the audience out there, it's a huge audience, it's a multicultural audience, that they need to know about what it means to be a thinker, about what it means to be a philosopher, about what it means to engage in this activity that we call thinking.
Well, you know what I said about that early human being who scratched out the symbol? Thinking changes the world. And one of the things we have to take very seriously is that we live in a different world. The world we live in is such that we face something very profound, which is humanity is aware of what it is to live now on a smaller planet, a more crowded planet, and a world in which thought can actually be communicated more quickly. What that means is that we now face the global responsibility not only for knowledge, but also for responsibility itself. So thinking, real thinking, is something that we need to do right now as we try our best to make it into the next century.
Well, the conversation had just begun, but I only have 2 minutes left, so I'm going to ask my guest one final question with which I would like to end this reflection. In this piece that I read, I was very disturbed by one term called Raza. Very disturbed. It's so contemporaneous, I think, with what even my guests out there might be secretly suffering from without knowing that they are. What is this term?
It's a term, well, a lot of people don't understand. This is a term from medieval Iberia or Andalusia, because what many people don't realize is that North African Muslims, right, Afro-Muslims, had dominated Europe, dominated Christendom in its southern area of the Mediterranean for 800 years. And they brought in a language, for instance, Ra, which you get like Ra, like the sun in the Egyptian, but Ra like Rosh in Hebrew for head.
Yes.
But it's another way of saying the beginning or the origin. And since they were from elsewhere, Ra became Raza to refer to the people from elsewhere. But when there was what the Christians call the Reconquest, they began to use the term in the negative, that the people from elsewhere don't belong here, and it became a term to refer originally to Jews and Moors.
Incredible. Well, this has been your host, Teodros Kiros, interviewing one of the luminaries of our time, which is exactly what I promised you were going to witness. I wish you have done that. Again, good evening. Thanks for staying with us. Teodros Kiros for African Ascent.